In February 2015, an expert forum gathered in Antalya, Turkey, to lay the framework for more effective disaster risk reduction approaches, particularly in the face of changing climate. Humans have been focused on and struggled with their relationship with the natural world. How do we balance our needs with sustainable use of natural resources? How do we live in harmony with such a dynamic and often harsh place? Weather systems, long-term climate, disease, famine, even our moving continental plates are a constant source of instability and challenge that, when seen through the lens of societies, are natural disasters. What's more, human dynamics are in flux. Population, dependency on resources, and our distributions across the globe. Modern societies are enhancing a naturally changing climate through increasing atmospheric greenhouse gases and other pollutants. Science describes conditions that are accelerating or destabilizing. Matters are further complicated by disaster risk management budgets that are only gradually increasing and, in some cases, reducing. These challenges present a formidable test of current local, national, and global strategies for coping with natural hazards. How do communities decide on best courses of action when we cannot grasp for certain the full scope of what will happen tomorrow, a decade, or in a century? What is disaster risk reduction?
To me, DRR is anything and everything you can do to reduce impact of natural hazards. This can be through a community preparedness. It can be as simple as doing drills, for example, either for children or for the entire community, or as complicated as establishing an early warning system for floods, tsunamis, cyclones.
You have the natural events, the natural hazards and events, and then you have the people that are preparing for, responding to, living in a particular climate. Then, their actions obviously are going to influence their vulnerability.
Are lessons being learned about lessons learned?
Because lessons learned is always about what went right and what went wrong and why, and what can we do better.
Just because somebody said, oh, we through this experience, through this project, through X DRR intervention, we learned X, Y, and Z. They use the phrase lesson learned, but in reality, nobody actually takes that lesson forward and applies it in whatever scenario it might be relevant to in the future. And so it's really more of a lesson identified at that point. And until it's put into practice, it's not a lesson learned.
I think there's a gap in understanding somewhere which has not allowed it to actually take place.
Lessons from disasters, droughts, floods, famines, they seem to recur. The events recur, but the lessons recur. So it raises the question, are we learning from past disasters on how to prepare for future ones?
There's so much need of addressing those issues of lack of implementation of the things that are just on papers that really creates a gap on acceptance of these so-called development plannings of a country.
Two of the benefits of effective DRR are the lives and resources saved with preventative, not recovery measures. Unfortunately, this is not where most of our efforts go.
We're saying you invest 10,000th of that, or even less than that, into something that will help you be better prepared the next time such an event rolls out. And that, to my knowledge, has not happened.
To do something preventive to make sure that your infrastructure, your livelihoods, etc., are resilient, they can rebound relatively quickly, requires generally less effort than trying to kind of rebuild everything in the wake of a traumatic event.
In a 2014 report, approximately $22 billion was spent on humanitarian assistance worldwide by donors. The amount of resources spent on disaster risk reduction is, of course, a very small portion of that.
So it's very important for us to take account of that and take measures in advance in order to prevent these long-term effects.
In February 2015, 94 researchers and specialists from 43 countries gathered in Antalya, Turkey. The purpose of this assembly of disaster risk reduction experts was to examine why lessons learned from disasters are not readily translated into strategies to protect societies from future events, and developing courses of action to improve this vexing condition. Members identified examples of effective disaster risk reduction efforts and evaluated the mechanisms that facilitated these successes.
The idea behind it is not to forget that there are successes or outcomes.
We do think that some have its opportunity. So every disaster happens, it really provides us the opportunity to better understand the change. It's like a very good triggering factor.
Good DRR happens when all of the stakeholders partake and communicate with each other. Two-way communication of needs and knowledge.
Many of the techniques are very simple. Going into a community, living on their terms, looking around, talking to them, learning from them, as well as teaching in an exchange. For us, we think that #1 vehicle for bringing it to the people is indeed the scientific process. So it is not about scientists going in, producing knowledge, and then translating that in a linear fashion to the non-scientists. Instead, from the beginning, the policymakers, the practitioners, the community leaders, the people in the street, they need to be involved so they accept, understand, and are engaged with the scientific process, and therefore the knowledge belongs to everyone.
The knowledge is in the communities. We pretend many times, not like in the past, no, when I was just starting, not like pretend that I arrive with information that that we can provide to the people and say you have to do this and you have to do this. But the reality is that they have the information. Like at village level, at municipality level, the people have the ideas. They just need maybe technical support, technical advice, in some cases funds, but I think the most important thing is to listen in reality, like what are the plans, what they want to do. And it was absolutely brilliant to see how the municipalities, the communities, they really did very, very well on doing the actions.
If we come out with the forecast for the season, we disseminate this information through the FM stations, through the television, through face-to-face with the communities. So as much as possible, we try to make so many people aware of the impending maybe dangers associated with the coming of the rains. We allow the farmers to come out with their indigenous forecasts. And then we also come out with the scientific forecasts. And then we harmonize the two.
When does DRR break down? And what have people identified as the primary causes for these failures?
Each time you have to a certain extent successes and at the very same time shortcomings and even failures. You see, it's a mix of both.
There are different ways to look at why lessons are identified after every disaster, but not applied.
Look at the governments. They have a 4-year time expectation, so that's how they compute their activity. Between national and local, there are plenty of people making their living of that, and they will change the topic from year to year, and the problem will still go on because it's not intended to resolve the problem, it's intended to reproduce their own living.
There are programs where government people collect the information from community people, but they are done just for the sake of doing them. So, they do lots of EIA and lots of public participation programs, but they are all just in papers. Like when you go and monitor them and try and evaluate them on the site, then you don't see fish ladders, you don't see how the communities that have been directly affected by construction of dams or different structures, like they have not been compensated what they were promised before construction.
Sadly, a lot of those examples come from governments, and governments are obviously constrained by the external forces on them, such as the media, such as the population, such as finances. When we find bad practice examples, a lot of it is because those with the power and resources to enact the control to deal with the disaster almost made an active decision not to. Very specifically, the one which rises its ugly head again and again is Hurricane Katrina. In that circumstances, there was decades of policy, research, and practice, knowing that there was extensive vulnerability to hurricane. A major hurricane could happen, and it was fairly clear that the richest, most powerful country in the world could have known exactly what to do.
There's already a lot of efforts being done on the forecasting side of things. There's a lot of NGOs working, but there's limited efforts to really translate that information from the national forecasting agencies really to the community level and make sure that community people actually get this information, which maybe in some sense it's quite complex, but I do believe that it can be translated and it can be beneficial for them.
Sharing, negotiations, and synthesis discussions during the conference culminated in the Antalya Statement.
The statement is a synthesis of the major lessons that still need to be put into practice for the future in order to improve DRR. And I think there's a ramification statement at the beginning of the statement that says unless these things are done, you'll continue to see suboptimal results, or it can lead to greater loss of property, life, inefficiency.
The statement outlined 6 calls to action, all of which are meant to empower, unite, and activate the spectrum of vested stakeholders.
The research is a complex process, and the outcomes are often not easily applicable to real-world practices. And indeed, this is what is necessary, what's needed in the real life, especially in the context of disaster risk reduction, because when you have a flood forecast, and if there is the uncertainty with the prediction, then you need to communicate this uncertainty to the people.
Efficient DRR should include a wide variety of participants, almost every part of the community and every sector is involved. I know it's difficult because it requires a lot of coordination, but if we leave one part of the society, then we're failing to meet the needs of everybody.
Having like the whole picture of disaster risk reduction, all the different components that have to be there is so important. And it's really important to integrate that clearly since the very beginning.
So we have to work on strengthening these national level organizations and try and work on decentralizing them and building the capacity of the regional and local offices.
There are lessons to be learned from past disasters. Resilient adaptation can happen when governments, NGOs, educators, evaluators, scientists, and first and zero-order responders listen and inform each other. The Antalya Statement recognizes this and look to identify a best next step towards streamlining the sharing of knowledge and methods.
One of the greatest challenges is when we communicate, sometimes as the specialists communicate, how we communicate amongst ourselves, across the sectors, as well as to communities who, in many cases, are the end users of the information. Localizing that information and making it more relevant to the local communities and age groups has much greater impact.
There needs to be a clearinghouse, in today's terminology, a portal, a knowledge portal, where we can accumulate these lessons from all over the place, categorize them, and archive them for open access.
I think we need a kind of knowledge portal where we structure, analyze, assess in a more in-depth way, in a more structured way, the knowledge and the lessons learned.
And we need to make sure that researchers, the scientists, they also try to find a way to have this complex information communicated to the simple people. And this necessitates a strong collaboration between the scientific people, the mathematics people, and the social scientists.
One way to make sure that there is good uptake is to actually define the impacts in terms that they're understandable by general public and by politicians and policymakers. Some of that, for good or bad, is described in terms of dollars and cents.
And in a way, removing the barrier between this very valuable information and then having this in an efficient way, in an effective way, so that the damages, the effects, the impacts of the for example, a flood disaster is minimized.
So kind of a database of like what has already been done here and what has been learned, what kinds of things do we need to take into consideration when implementing X project in this area, because there are certainly, in most places, probably other people who have done relevant work and who have learned relevant lessons in that area as well. But that's a huge endeavor, so how to actually create a portal that can filter information and make sure that only quality information is there, while at the same time allowing people kind of open access and contributions would be something that is worth considering, but would be a long-term project.
There is no simple road forward giving DRR more traction. However, the Antalya Statement is a powerful step towards identifying where current measures are falling short and making suggestions on best next steps. Such exercises cannot be left to stand alone. The insights gained must be followed up by measurable action and evaluations for future management strategies. What cannot be disputed is the value gained from input and collaboration across parties vested in reducing our vulnerabilities to future disasters.